He rides in darkness, where the light of reason dies out and the screams of the past still echo. His hooves leave no trace, but his presence is felt as a chill crawling up your spine. You've heard of him, the Headless Horseman. On the silver screen, he appears as a swift, vengeful, grotesque spectre. But the truth behind the fiction is far darker. Long before Hollywood, long before Washington Irving's pen sketched the contours of Sleepy Hollow, tales were whispered of this accursed being, astride a horse whose eyes burned with infernal light, galloping across the fields of medieval Europe as a portent of death. The real legend does not begin with an American tale, but with terrors much older, buried under centuries of superstition, blood, and silence. And when we unearth the origins of this myth, we discover something even more horrifying. An ancient symbol of eternal punishment, whose severed head represents not just the loss of identity, but the curse of an incomplete fate. A spirit doomed to ride not for revenge, but because it has never found rest. Today, we will follow the true Headless Horseman's trail and discover why reality, once again, is far more terrifying than fiction. Long before Sleepy Hollow's woods saw spectral gallops, the echo of a headless night already reverberated through Ireland's damp forests and Scotland's shadowed hills. The Headless Horseman archetype has deep roots in Celtic belief, where death and magic entwined like the twisted branches of an ancient wood. The oldest name we know for this spirit is Dullahan, an entity from Irish folklore shrouded in darkness and secrets. But unlike the modern fictional image, the Dullahan was not a soldier seeking vengeance. He was a harbinger of death. Described as a figure mounted on a coal-black steed with flaming eyes, the Dullahan carried his own head under his arm. His face, pale, decaying, with eyes that darted ceaselessly in every direction, seemed to peer into everything, even souls. His mouth twisted into a grotesque grin, far too wide for any human, as though mocking the living. When he halted his mount, it was said someone would die. There was no escape from his judgment. No locked door could bar his way. No prayer could turn him aside. He would call the victim's name, and they would fall dead at once. The Dullahan's presence was never random. It was bound to ancient sacrificial rites and the Celtic vision of life as an eternal cycle in which death was merely a transition. Yet not all made that passage peacefully. Some, like the Headless Horseman, remained caught between worlds, condemned to repeat their journey for eternity, carrying the symbol of their own incompleteness: the severed head, the mutilated spirit. The legend crossed Ireland's shores and, over the centuries, adapted to the fears of every culture that absorbed it. In medieval Germany, for instance, there arose a version of the decapitated knight as a soldier condemned for his atrocities during feudal wars, his soul never resting. He did not appear to kill, but to remind of war's weight, of the living's guilt, and of the eternity awaiting those who defile the sacred. In Brittany, the horseman was seen as an omen. His steed trod silently, as though walking on veils between worlds. Any who saw him were told to fear not only for themselves, but for their entire lineage. He was the seed of a curse. These older versions share essential traits. The rider is headless, he travels by night, and his appearance is always linked to death, guilt, or spiritual imbalance. But there is something even more unsettling. He speaks only to pronounce the names of the condemned, and words uttered by a mouth detached from its body carry a power beyond human understanding. Over time, this ancient myth metamorphosed, absorbing the popular terrors of each era. Yet its essence remained intact, an incomplete spectre condemned to exist between worlds, with his head in hand and his soul lost on the fields of the beyond. A messenger of doom who kills not in rage, but by decree of greater forces never fully understood. This first section reveals how the Headless Horseman did not arise as a villain of stories or films, but as an entity embodying humanity's deepest fear. Inevitable, impersonal, unalterable death. A reminder that ancient pre-Christian powers were never tamed or forgotten, only silenced by time's shadows. And when you hear hoofbeats in the dead of night, best recall that it may not be a horse, but the return of a presence that never truly left. As the Headless Horseman's myth spread across Europe, it took on ever more sinister contours, reflecting a Middle Ages ravaged by plague, endless wars, and dread of the unknown. In an age perceived as a constant battle between the divine and the profane, disturbing accounts emerged of headless knights appearing on lonely roads, crossing villages under moonless skies, always heralding disaster. But what few know is that these apparitions were not merely campfire tales. They were chronicled by monks, whispered even within abbey walls. In regions of France, such as Brittany and Normandy, the Headless Horseman was called Le Cavalier Noir. He did more than wander, he hunted. It was said he sought out those who had broken sacred oaths, knights who betrayed their codes or desecrated relics. In one 12th century account, a monk described an entire noble retinue vanishing after crossing a mist-shrouded lane. Days later, their blood-stained horses were found, but no trace of the riders. The only clue was the imprint of a scorching horseshoe at the path's center and a symbol carved into a tree, a skull pierced by a sword. The medieval Headless Horseman was more than an omen. He became an executioner, and in certain lore, it was believed he was not a mere damned spirit, but someone who had made a pact with infernal forces. In exchange for power or revenge, he relinquished his own soul, becoming a creature of another realm, sustained by a profane oath. These cursed knights, stories say, had their bodies preserved by darkness and their heads severed as the pact's seal. They could peer beyond life, traverse worlds, and with a single touch reap the lives of the living. In German lands, especially during centuries of internecine warfare, the decapitated knight assumed even more terrifying proportions. It was told he wandered battlefields, striding among the fallen, gathering the spirits of dishonored warriors. In one southern German legend, a young squire witnessed a mounted figure moving among corpses after a castle siege. The knight bore his own head, and pressing it against the dead chests, forced them to scream in torment, as if being torn from existence. Such tales fueled popular imagination with both dread and reverence. This was no ordinary ghost. He stood as a living reminder that violating the balance between duty and sacrilege summoned consequences beyond death. The fear was not merely of dying, but of being chosen for a fate far worse, to wander eternally, incomplete between the realms of the living and the dead, with one's head in hand and one's conscience laid bare. Even among the Knights Templar, there survive apocryphal rumors. Certain brethren who engaged in forbidden rites in search of mystical power were said to be punished with the symbolic decapitation of their souls, becoming specters condemned to roam Earth's spiritual deserts. They sought not redemption, but relief, a relief that never came. These medieval narratives were more than mere stories. They were cautionary codes reminding those who bore the sword that blood left stains beyond this life, and that the Headless Horseman, whether as punishment, portent, or pact, could not be halted, for he had already relinquished all that made him human. Thus, roads, forests, and battlefields became stages for encounters with this emissary from beyond. No era mattered. Wherever there was pride unchecked, betrayal, or hunger for power, he returned. For his existence was fed by the living's mistakes, and his pact, sealed with blood and silence, could never be undone. Over time, the Headless Horseman crossed oceans, carried not only by migrants, but by ancestral fears preserved in oral tradition. When European settlers reached the Americas, they brought their myths, their demons, their curses, and among them, the decapitated specter. Yet, it was on the fertile soil of young America that this legend would assume a new form, a new name, and enduring fame. In 1820, Washington Irving published The Legend of Sleepy Hollow, immortalizing the Headless Horseman as a symbol of American dread, blending European folklore with the anxieties of a nation in its infancy. In Irving's tale, the horseman is a Hessian soldier, a German mercenary who fought for the British crown during the American War of Independence, whose head was torn away by a cannonball. Condemned to haunt the woods of remote Sleepy Hollow, he terrorized lonely pathways in search of his lost head. Irving's genius lay in giving a face, or rather an absence, to collective fear. The trauma of war, the forest's mystery, the struggle between reason and superstition. Few realize how closely this American version preserves the ancestral myth's core. The hunt for a head, the midnight ride, the link to a violent death, all echo the Dullahan's Celtic roots and Europe's medieval specters. The difference lies in tone. Irving softened the terror, lent it satire and ambiguity, suggesting perhaps the frightful events were but a trick to unnerve the timid Ichabod Crane. Yet by then the seed was sown, and it would bloom again in far darker forms. Film and television have since restored the Headless Horseman's original horror. In Tim Burton's Sleepy Hollow, the figure takes on more diabolical contours, merging Germanic cruelty with the Dullahan's supernatural presence. The horseman is no longer a mere soldier. He is an executioner, a servant of darkness, reaping lives with brutal efficiency. The twisted trees, the fog-shrouded landscapes, all evoke haunted fields of medieval Europe. Hollywood, perhaps unwittingly, reconnected the American myth to its pagan origins, and it did not stop there. In countless modern adaptations, the Headless Horseman appears as a multi-dimensional entity, sometimes a reflection of unresolved trauma, at others, a vengeful spirit, and in bold retellings, a judge of sinners, a supernatural executioner. Across these incarnations, one constant remains: the profound unease evoked by a being lacking a head yet still riding with purpose. This image itself defies logic, forcing audiences to confront the impossible. Beyond mere entertainment, the Headless Horseman endures as an archetype in the collective unconscious. He embodies what is incomplete, what has been violently torn from natural order. He is guilt made flesh, the error that cannot be undone. Wherever injustice or inexplicable death occurs, he may reappear. Perhaps that is why he remains so compelling. He reminds us of forces we do not understand, yet which continue to watch us, and from time to time, visit us. Even today, some claim to hear hoofbeats on empty roads. In villages across America and Europe, people report seeing a mounted shadow, clutching something under its arm, always at dusk. Are these merely stories? Perhaps. Yet it is striking how this figure, born in ancient Celtic rites and sculpted by medieval horror, still dwells in modern fears. The truth is that the Headless Horseman never ceased riding. He merely waits for the right moment to reappear, when darkness is thickest and men are most vulnerable to what they have long forgotten to fear. By tracing the Headless Horseman's footsteps through the centuries, we uncover far more than a simple folktale. We discover a persistent echo of human anguish, shaped by the cold hands of fear and guilt. From Ireland's mist-laden woods to Europe's blood-soaked fields, through Sleepy Hollow's silent lanes, this entity haunts us as a symbol of what cannot be buried. His severed head is not merely a horror image, it represents a fragmented spirit, wandering between worlds, never finding peace. The Headless Horseman endures through the ages because he taps into something elemental in our psyche: the fragility of life. the weight of our transgressions, and the uncertainty of what lies beyond death. When Irving transformed this myth into an American tale, he merely gave fresh voice to an ancient scream, muffled by time, but never silenced. And cinema, in resurrecting him with blood and shadow, reaffirmed that certain stories are eternal because they feed on what lies deepest within us. So, the next time you hear hoofbeats in the distance, even if you see nothing, remember, some legends do not die because they belong to all times. The headless horseman still rides, between the real and the imagined, waiting for a new name to call. For the curse, like fear itself, never sleeps.